There isn't much Christmas cheer around the cabinet tables of Europe as nations struggle to respond to crippling financial woes. The troubles have already hit government revenues here, and the fear is there might be worse to come. One man who saw the European warning signs earlier than most is Westpac's chief economist, Bill Evans, and he joins us to read the tea leaves on what the new year might bring for Australia and what that might mean for you. Bill Evans, welcome.
Thanks, Chris.
You're a little bit more pessimistic about Australian growth next year than either the government or the Reserve Bank. Why?
Chris, look, I think the theme for next year is going to be one of stimulus. We're seeing interest rates coming down in Australia, and I think there's further to go for those. In Europe, I think that the central bank there will embark upon a quantitative easing policy, and that's going to allay a number of the short-term concerns there. I think in the US we'll see the same, and most importantly, China has now reversed its tightening policy. So I think next year will be in two halves. The first half, it'll take time for those stimuluses to have their impact, so it'll be a slower half than the second. So we think 3% growth next year, with a little over 2% pace in the first half and near a 4% pace in the second half.
When you say quantitative easing, of course, that means pumping more money into the economies to help stimulate growth there. But what does a slower economic growth in Australia mean to a layperson?
Well, I think what we will see in the first half of this year will be the unemployment rate edging up a little further. If we look at the trends in the labour market in the last couple of years, in the second half of last year, we created nearly 200,000 jobs. In the second half of this year, about 10,000. So the labour market is slowing, and because the stimuluses are only just starting, there'll be a lag. So we'll see a further slowing in the labour market next year, which will see the unemployment rate edging up to about 5.75%. But I think that'll be the high point, and I think in the second half we'll start to see some improvement.
And interestingly, that doesn't mean necessarily that people will lose their jobs. It's just that the economy is not growing fast enough to sop up those people who are coming into it.
Yes, you need about 1% growth in employment to absorb the increase in the workforce, and I don't think we'll get with that 1% pace in the first half of next year.
What about China? That's been the engine room of our growth, but there's predictions that it will slow. But to us, to outsiders, growth rate of 7.5% seems enormous. Why isn't that enough for China?
Well, if we think about it, 7.5% is probably their slowest pace since the Asian financial crisis, so everything's relative. They had 9% in 2011 and nearly 12% in 2010. So they're coming off very, very, very strong growth, and it's all about change. However, with China, 7.5% for the year, I would expect that they've only just started to reverse their strong tightening policies. And in China, it does take 2 to 3 quarters for a change in stance to have an impact. So that suggests to me that the second half of next year, China might be running at an 8 or a bit over 8% pace, but in the first half, more like a 6.5% pace.
When people pick up the paper and they see constant talk about the mining boom, enormous amounts of investment, why is it that many people aren't feeling that growth?
Well, I think it's very much to do with where the jobs are in this economy. Retail, about 15% of the jobs are in retail, about 10% in construction, about 10% in manufacturing, and only 2% of jobs are in mining. So if the activity moves towards mining, it's just not possible for them to absorb the jobs that might be lost in the other areas that are being affected by the very high currency, the cautious consumer, and up until recently, of course, of very high interest rates.
How concerned should we be about Europe? It seems that almost every week we hear about another prescription for a cure, and then the markets take it well in the short term and take it badly in the long run.
Look, I think that the critical thing is that if you have a currency union, you have to have a fiscal union. So you have to have one fiscal policy. Now, the transition to that is going to take a lot of time. And in the meantime, the markets need to be placated. Now, if the central bank is printing money, buying government bonds, holding down bond yields, then that buys time for these other big changes that need to happen. And we really don't know whether the Europeans will accept those big changes. And if they don't, and if it eventually turns out they're not prepared to, then we'll probably see the euro break down. But I think that's some way off, and we need to see whether acceptance of that close fiscal alignment can be made. But in the meantime, the central bank needs to do its job in placating markets and ensuring that bond rates don't go too far. And we've seen some success. Italian bond rates got up to 7.3, they're now down to 6.8. Spanish bond rates got well over 6, they're now down to 5.5. So some success is being achieved.
What's the possibility we might see a return to a credit crunch where banks aren't lending to banks and then things get really quite desperate indeed?
Well, that's one of the big factors we saw last night, where the European Central Bank lent about 500 billion euros to the banks to ensure that their funding was there. Now, whether they decide to lend that or whether they put it back on deposit with the ECB becomes a question. Of course, we saw in 2008 the American banks that were very, very slow to lend. That does represent a big question mark for 2012.
But the big question mark here, of course, is what the Reserve Bank will do, and you believe that they'll cut rates again?
Oh, I think so. Back in July, we predicted they'd cut by 100. They're halfway there. They've done 50. I would expect we'll get another 25 in February and possibly more after that. I think it's the right thing to do. Our interest rates are too high. Those sectors of the economy that are sensitive to interest rates, such as the consumer sector, housing, need lower rates.
But finally, though, the big question is, will the banks pass that on? Is the cash rate going to be disconnected now from what we're seeing in our mortgage rates?
Well, these are very uncertain times for banks globally, and these pricing decisions are tough. I'm not going to speculate as to exactly what will happen, but what I do believe is that if the Reserve Bank's cutting interest rates, that's good for the economy.
Well, Bill Evans, have a good Christmas, and let's hope we all do.
Thanks, Chris.